and we are all yours. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is so important, and I will just let you now with them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you via the screen here today. First, I just want to acknowledge and thank Victor for hosting me today. I hope all of you are fully aware of how lucky you are to have such a great professor who is so mindful of different ways of knowing, different worldviews as it comes in the world of design. And how thrilling it is that he's hosting this amazing class for you this semester. So I hope you're all enjoying it. So as Victor said, my name is Jeniffer Fix. I am an associate and urban planner with Dialogue. Dialogue is an integrated design firm with studios in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, and San Francisco. And together we are urban planners, urban designers, landscape architects, engineers, interior designers. And we do lots of different types of projects, but the work I'll be talking about today is really more within the context of urban design and urban planning, because that's my world. And so, with the theme of your course being, this point in the course being women's way of knowing, I'll talk about that within the context of cities. And so on the screen, you'll see I have a title there, The City She Knows. Those are my two little nieces there, crossing the street in front of my former home in Vancouver. And before I dive into things, I just want to focus on that one word, she, in the title slide. And I want to acknowledge that throughout the presentation, I'm going to be drawing on a lot of data, interviews with women. But I want to acknowledge that, of course, when we talk about women as a specific group, we do sometimes run the risk of reinforcing gender stereotypes. And we, of course, know that gender itself is not a binary, it's a spectrum. So I just want us to be mindful of that and intersectionality as we talk through these slides. And I also want to talk about, I also just want to set a bit of context too, that, I'm a woman who has privilege. I'm, based on my skin color, my education, my class, the privileges that have been afforded to me throughout my life. And so the experiences and the perspectives that I'm sharing today come from that context. And there are a tremendous amount of diversity within groups who I self-identify as women when we talk about ethnicity, country of origin, income, class, able-bodiedness, sexual orientation, and all of those perspectives are so valuable and needed. And so that'll be a theme that comes up throughout the presentation as well. So what I want to say, despite the fact that we don't, we like to think of gender as a spectrum and not a binary. When we look at the data around how women know the city, how they experience the city, on average, people who identify as women experience it and know it differently than those who identify as men. And so women, for example, are more likely to experience urban poverty. They're more likely to head single-parent households. Women are more likely to be responsible for childcare and elder care, and as a result are more likely to have complex travel behavior within the city. So they're more likely, on average, than men to take more trips, smaller trips, and more complex trips to different destinations, which means that their travel needs sometimes are different, their transportation needs. They're more likely to take transit, they're more likely to work shift work, and they're more likely to experience sexual assault and sexual harassment in the public realm and public spaces. So women do experience and know the city differently. We know this from research, we know this from data on how they engage with the city. So today I want to talk about how cities are designed, who they're designed for, and how they can be designed for women. I'm going to talk about how cities can be designed by women and how cities can be designed with women. So to begin with the cities for women, when we examine whose identities and contributions have been celebrated within the city, within the public realm, we see that it's largely been those of, historically in the West, so in Canada, and in the US, wealthier Caucasian men. So as an example, in New York City, we know that there are no bridge, no major building No Long Boulevard named after a woman. In Central Park, there are 23 statues, 23 monuments. None of them are of actual women. There are a few of fictional women, so Mother Goose, angels, nymphs, but not of actual women. And until this past year, one of the monuments celebrated a surgeon who was prominent at the turn of the century in the field of gynecology, and he experimented on Black women without any pain medication. So, the question is, why does this matter? Why does it matter who we're celebrating in the public realm, and what does that mean for how women come to know the city? There's a great quote by Rebecca Solnit. She's an essayist who writes about these issues in the States. She says, I'll just read the quote here. A city is a book we read by wandering its streets, a text that favors one version of history and suppresses others, enlarges your identity or reduces it, makes you feel important or disposable, depending on who you are and what you are. So the argument here is that when we think about who we are celebrating in the public realm, whether they be through our street names, our public names, the names of our monuments, etc., who constitutes our monuments, it tells much more of a story than, what happened in history. They're more than figures of stone, but they're symbols of who holds cultural power. And as a result of that, we're, starting to convey who we think is important and who matters. So there's some really interesting work being done to imagine different futures. This is a collaboration between Rebecca Solnit, the woman whose quote I just referenced, and someone else named Joshua Jelly Shapiro in New York City. And they took the New York City map, subway map, and they reimagined it. So virtually all of the names, the ones that are of people, are of men. And so they renamed them using women's names. So we have, Gloria Steinem, Beyonce, Jane Jacobs, Joni Mitchell, Lena Dunham, a reimagination of kind of what the city can look like within, when we're celebrating the accomplishments of women. And you don't need to dig very deeply. So if you look so my former neighborhood in Vancouver was Strathcona. And for a while, the city of Vancouver, I think this was now in the early 60s, I believe, they had a proposal to run a freeway through that neighborhood, to connect to what is now the Georgia Viaduct. And that would have displaced hundreds or thousands of people, basically decimating that neighborhood. And they drummed up these plans with zero consultation with the community. And it was looking as though the plan was going to go forward, was going to get implemented. But a large group of Strathcona residents, many of them elderly Chinese women, rallied against this issue, and they were able to galvanize enough support to stop this project. So in many ways, these women whose names we don't really know, or at least aren't commonly known, were central in transforming East Vancouver and making it what it is today. And so there are, many opportunities, many heroes of our past that you don't need to look very deeply to celebrate. And of course, we can't talk about gender without talking about sexual orientation. And these are some pedestrian lights in Vienna that show different types of pedestrians. So typically you have just the male walker, stick man figure crossing the street. They've implemented new street lights that show same-sex couples hand in hand crossing streets. When you look back to history, what is the first feminist critique of the city? One of the landmark papers was published by a woman named Dolores Hayden. She was a professor of architecture in the States. And she wrote a paper in 1980 titled, "What Does a Non-Sexist City Look Like?" And in this paper, she took aim at the Garden City movement. So the Garden City movement, for those of you who don't know, was a very popular urban planning, urban design movement at the turn of the last century that that was trying to essentially separate the city center, so the central business district and the neighborhoods that had been surrounding it, to create a new type of city where you focus jobs and employment within the central city, but then you move households, people, into the outskirts, separating the city center by a green belt. And implicit in this design approach is that a woman's place is in the home and not kind of outside of the morally dubious setting of the city. And so this gave way to, in part, one of the drivers behind, the explosion of suburbia post World War II, and what it really resulted in. And I'm sure this was not the intention at the time, but that women's domestic responsibilities increased. They now had larger homes, larger yards to care for, and it also made them more isolated and more vulnerable. So before, when they had access to services and amenities and social networks within the city center, they no longer had that. They are now out in the suburbs, and if they wanted to leave their husband, not only did they have to find new housing, they had to establish new neighborhood, or get a new neighborhood, new job, and new social networks. So she was quite critical of this movement. So if you fast forward to today and look around the world at precedents where gender is top of mind around city design, city planning, there's some really great examples emerging in Europe. So this is from Vienna. Gender mainstreaming refers to a policy approach in which gender is used as a lens to create strategies and design approaches in city building. And so in the early 1990s, a woman by the name of Eva Kale, she worked at the city of Vienna. She was an urban planner. She launched a photo exhibit along with some colleagues called Who Owns Public Space? And they followed women around Vienna to see how they engaged with the city. And they found that, of course, women's experience and ways of knowing and activities were incredibly diverse within the city, but a couple of the common themes that emerged across these experiences were a woman's desire to have ease of movement, to get around easily, and safety. And so coming out of this exercise, coupled with a tremendous amount of evidence-based design, looking at, not just observing how women engage with the city, but looking at data around how they engage with the city, they launched 60 pilot projects. And this was the first one, the one on the left, Frauenwerkstatt, which means Women Work City. And so the purpose of this project was literally, quote, to make life easier for women. The architect is Franziska Allmann, and she designed this project where it's a residential development, as you can see, low-rise multifamily apartments. They had flat layouts. They overlooked a communal backyard, so people could, through natural surveillance, be in their homes and watch children playing in a shared backyard. They had an on-site kindergarten, an on-site daycare, doctor's office. They were in close proximity to frequent and reliable transit. They deployed crime prevention through environmental design, or SEPTED principles, which is designing in a way that fosters safety, reduces places of hiding, and so forth in public spaces. And this is now considered a UN Habitat global best practice, and how successful it's been. The city of Vienna also applied some of the gender mainstreaming thinking to public spaces. So they implemented extensive lighting throughout the city, widened sidewalks, added massive ramps so people walking with strollers could easily navigate through sloped areas. They had, in parks, they added toilets, change tables, fountains, shades, seating to watch places for children playing. And they also discovered something totally fascinating. They started to observe the way boys and girls played differently in public spaces. And so they looked at two of the major public parks in Vienna, and they discovered that boys and girls were equally represented in these public spaces until about the age of 9. And then it dropped. The little girls' presence in the park dropped substantially. And they couldn't figure it out. They were, perplexed as to why this would be the case. So they talked to the little girls. They observed how little girls and little boys are playing in the spaces, and they noticed that on average, little boys were spatially asserting themselves more than were the girls. And so in the kind of competition for space, girls were losing out. So what they did is they took these two parks that had really open, expansive spaces, and they added programming. So they added badminton courts, seating, footpaths, the other interventions, and then almost immediately that gender ratio balanced out. The little girls came back, and it was 50-50 again, which is really interesting. That something that maybe we wouldn't have even noticed had we not made the effort to look for it. this is an example. This is a museum. This is an ad for one of the exhibits that ran until this past spring at this museum in Umia. And Umia is positioning itself as the gender equal city. It's the first museum of women's history. And it's, recognizing that museums are one of the most important civic institutions in the way we know our city. So it's not only, a reflection of the past, but it's also a commentary on how we, think about our cities and how we can shape its future. And so it's the first women's museum history in the world. This exhibit was specifically about how it was, showing photographs taken by women and how they see literally through the lens of a woman how she sees the city. And they also run these really interesting gendered landscape tours. So this is where they take visitors on bus tours of the city and they explore the city through a gender lens. And one of the stops is this place called Lev, which means live. And this is an underground passage that goes underneath a railway track in Umia. And in the past, there were concerns around safety and this kind of narrow pedestrian corridor going underneath the bridge, especially at nighttime. And so what they did is they had hosted a series of workshops with people in the community around how they could make this a better women-friendly space. And so they co-designed a series of solutions. They worked with the acoustics so that someone yelling for help, for example, beneath the railway track could be easily heard. They opened up the sight lines so that it was safer in terms of viewing. They removed hiding places, and they widened the entrances. And I think one of the more interesting features is that they incorporated dynamic public art. So this is a light installation that is moving and changing, and on it is poetry written by one of their most celebrated female poets in Umia. And what's most interesting about this project, I think, is not so much the design itself, because I think sometimes when we talk about design for women or design for gender, we run the risk of it being environmentally determinist. Because, of course, cities or design that cause violence against women or safety around women, it's patriarchy. So these workshops are really essential in bringing people together to have conversations about issues of patriarchy, violence, fear, and gender and power within public spaces. So it builds capacity around these issues in the city, which is really key. I'm just going to skip this one here. This example comes to us from Sweden. So a lot of Stockholm and other cities in Sweden are actually taking this gender lens to, beyond the design process and specifically into city budget. So how are we budgeting for city services and who benefits from these services? And so they were looking at these are screen captures from an educational video that they released. And so they were looking at snow clearance policy, and they discovered that if you look at the stats around how women were engaging the space, and again, these are averages, so a lot of women engage with space in the same way that average men do, and some men engage with the space and transportation systems in the same way that some women do. But on average, women are more likely to be looking after children, traveling with children in public spaces, more likely to be pedestrians, cyclists, and transit users. And then they discovered during snow events that they were pedestrians were 3 times more likely to have an injury associated with snow than were vehicle drivers. So women were disproportionately being injured during winter months due to snowy conditions. And historically, they had prioritized snow clearance and roadways and snow clearance to the center of the city, the CBD, the Central Business District, where their office buildings, but not prioritizing places like daycares, hospitals, employment centers where women were more likely to be employed. So they shifted their budgeting and they tried to make it more gender equal. So they prioritized pedestrian spaces, prioritized cycling spaces, prioritized daycares, hospitals, and they feel that this gender budgeting approach is now more equitable and is more embracing of how women engage and experience and know the city. And so the examples I've given you so far are very much kind of, top down in the sense that they're design interventions or solutions that are deployed by city halls typically, but there are lots of really wonderful grassroots examples of where women are working together to empower themselves and empower others and create solidarity around how women engage in public space. And so this example, has anyone heard of Hollaback by any chance?
Have you? No.
Hollaback? It's a thing that started in New York City, but Vancouver now has one. I don't know if Richmond also has a platform, but you can go online, go onto this website, Hollaback, and essentially it's an interactive mapping tool where if you have felt like you've been, and I think it's largely women who engage with this, but if you felt like you've been harassed or felt unsafe, you can drop a pinpoint on the map and tell your story. And, it's not necessarily intended to, there's not much that can be done once, that's obviously happened in the past, but the woman who runs it was saying that, the point is here, inspired by the Me Too movement, it's this idea that, people can click on that experience you've had and a little note will pop up, I've got your back. And it's this creation of solidarity and this creation that you are, you have a shared experience, a shared way of knowing with other women in the city. Okay, so those are cities for women. I want to talk a little bit about cities by women. And cities by women, great. You look at the city design process. If you look at architecture, landscape architecture, urban design planning, who is making decisions about how we inhabit our cities? Who are the leaders sitting around the leadership table making these decisions? Who is authoring the plans? Who is holding the pen for the design? And does it even matter? And if we look at some numbers, and this is taken from, this is some number crunching that we did looking at planning in Vancouver, Metro Vancouver. So if you look at the numbers of women in Metro Vancouver, 51% are women. The population identify as women. At the University of British Columbia, the planning school, so this is the graduate program there, for the last 10, 15 or plus years, 55% or more of the graduates have been women. The same numbers apply for the UBC schools of landscape architecture and architecture. And yet when you look at the percentage of chief planners, so these are the people who are the boss, so to speak, of planning departments across all the various municipalities in Metro Vancouver, it drops down to 24%. And when you look at the chief planners who are in charge of the major cities, so cities of populations greater than 100,000 residents, where most of us live in Metro Vancouver, it drops further down to 17%. And this recent election, we saw, the results of the mayoral race. We have, I think, 3 out of 21 of our mayors are women, which is 14%. So there's a disconnect between the number of women who are pursuing city building professions within schools and who actually is rising to the top and who is in a position to be making the greatest decisions around city building and city design. So this is public sector. This is public sector in Metro Vancouver. This is more of an example. This is my firm, Dialogue. These are all the partners at Dialogue, and I've highlighted the women. Use the stereotypical color of pink to identify which are women, and we're sitting at about, I think, 85% are men, 15% women. And of course, in design firms like mine, we have a tremendous amount of influence working with our clients and our communities around how people inhabit the cities. It's really key that we have better representation. Around the world, of the 100 top architecture firms, only 3 of them are headed by women. So there's quite a disconnect here. So why women are leaving? So there's been some interesting research in the UK, in the US, and in Canada around why women are leaving these professions, or they're not rising to the top. And these are the reasons most often found. So low and unequal pay, long or inflexible working hours, they're sidelined to limited areas of work, so there's a sense of paternalism in some regards, stressful working conditions, a macho culture and sexism, lack of retainer training after maternity leave, slow rates of promotion, lack of female role models. So what's important here is that the woman's way of experiencing and knowing her city is an important part in the way she designs. And so if she's not around those decision-making tables, those perspectives sometimes are not going to get heard in the same way as they would if, of course, she was there around the table. And so just to give you a little bit of color, a little bit of more of a personalized touch to some of these issues, what I'll do is read out a few quotes. So I had the opportunity to interview several women at my firm. So these are women who are in all the disciplines I mentioned earlier: landscape architecture, urban design, planning, engineering, interior design. And I talk to women who are at all stages of their career, and I talk to women who have, diverse in terms of, I talk to women of color, Indigenous women, women of all different ages. And then I also talk to these 6 women. These are chief planners or former chief planners who are quite prominent in Canada. Some of you will recognize Jeniffer Fix's name there. She was a former chief planner of the city of Toronto and is running for mayor of Toronto. Election there is today, so it'll be really interesting to see the outcomes of that. So I interviewed these 6 women as well as the women at my firm, and I asked them 3 questions. And the first question was, how has being a woman shaped your professional trajectory or your experience in the city building movement, city building profession? And so one of the big themes that emerged across all of these conversations was that they had to deal with or overcome bias. And when I talk about bias, basically what that is, I'm sure all of you are aware of what that is, but the context in which I'm using it is, that we, all of us, women and men and others, we make mental shortcuts or quick judgments and assessments of people and situations based on our own personal experiences with societal stereotypes. And it can lead us to discriminate against people even when we don't know we're doing it. So a lot of women felt like they've had to deal with this bias in their profession. I'm going to read you a quote from a woman describing this phenomenon. She says, "As a woman, in order to be recognized, you have to do so much more than a male colleague. As a mother, you have to always balance the perception that you're putting your family first and you're able to do your job. I feel I always have to show, no matter what my family commitments are, that I'm excelling. In order to do that, I have to work like crazy. It's exhausting. I feel that eventually that it will be worthwhile. I feel like it has to pay off." Another theme that emerged in response to this question across all these different women who I spoke with was this idea that they had to navigate a legacy of male-centered workplaces, that the workplace emerged around, it was designed at a time when norms, behaviors, and cultures were almost exclusively male-centric, and when gender norms were more deeply entrenched. And so the vestiges of this legacy, this past, is still in place today, and so women had to navigate that. It made it more difficult. And here are a couple of quotes. So this one comes from one of the chief planners that I mentioned earlier. "We've made a lot of strides for women's equality, but we still have an imbalance and a patriarchy and a misogynist society, and that's endemic across society. We have so much privilege as white women, but if you think of white males, they have the ultimate privilege." And then a woman of color who I work with, she said this: "It's always obviously changing, but it does feel like you're always answering to men, whether they're the partners or the clients or the contractors or the subconsultants. And they speak a different language than women when they're together. In a meeting, you don't get the visual eye contact. You don't feel like you're part of the conversation. You have to work to be part of the conversation." A third theme that emerged in response to this question was around developing valuable skills. So some women said, I had to work hard, or I had to adapt to this male-centered workplace, and as a result, I developed skills, which was actually, somewhat beneficial. And so one woman said, this is the chief planner on the prairies, she says, "What I learned really quickly is to work through influence. I can't generalize with all the other women out there, but some have figured this out, that you can't come in with your big authoritative opinion, bang the table, and demand what you want. That's not an option. Having to navigate a professional world not tuned into wanting to listen to you, the skills that get developed for me included collaboration, influence, coalitions with other people. These are the skills that you need to be a city builder working within a bureaucracy." She felt it equipped her with some tools that have actually helped her in her career, which is kind of interesting. Another woman, this is Anne McAfee. She was the former chief planner in the city of Vancouver, and she was co-director at a time when Vancouverism really took off. So a lot of the things that make Vancouver what it is today and puts it on the global stage for urbanism really emerged around the time of her leadership. And she was involved in the early days when they were looking at the Canada Line before it was called the RAV line. This is now in the late 1990s. And she was involved in the design process. She was sitting around a table of all engineers, all men, and she was asking them, what about safety? Did you consider safety in the design? And they said, oh, yeah. It's seismically, it's going to be it's robust. We looked at, earthquake issues. We covered it. And she said, no. I'm talking about a mom with a carriage or a woman at nighttime. Have you considered that? So she was saying that, as a woman, she's developed skills just based simply on her own experience of the city that she brings to the design table, that she brought to the design table. The second question I asked these women was, why do you think women are underrepresented around city building leadership tables? And one of the most common things they said was, lack of accommodation of family needs. Now, I'm not suggesting, and they weren't suggesting, that women should be the primary caregiver of children, but the reality is women tend to take maternity leave or parental leave when they have children. Women, which means they're away from the workplace, and then we've got to deal with patriarchy within our households as well. But women, on average, do carry greater domestic burden than men in terms of the number of hours they spend per week on domestic duties. So this, of course, is a problem in the workplace, and they feel that there's been lack of accommodation within the workplace of family needs, which has greater effect for women based on the reasons I just said. So this is one quote that comes from a woman who is in my firm. She's based in the Toronto studio. She's a landscape architect. She says, I've heard from a few male partners in off-the-fly conversations or in jest that, well, if you have kids, you can't dedicate the time you need to be in a partner position because your focus is divided. Whenever I hear that, I want to blow someone away. You think of all the great women out there who've shaped our world, and they've had children, they've been married, they've had lives. So why is it so difficult in our profession to believe that we can't rear our children and be as we need to be in our careers as well? The other theme I heard in response to this question is around outright bias in traditional male culture, which is, came up earlier as well. And so here's a couple quotes. One is from a planning director who's now city manager for a municipality in Ontario. So she's now the top dog at her municipality. She says, I think there is some gender bias. From my experience, particularly in the previous organization, the bias toward hiring people you've already worked with, and they are overwhelmingly men who advance through the organization. Historically, men have been promoted more than women. Another woman, so Jeniffer Fix, who's the former chief planner of the city of Toronto, says, I discovered that gender imbalance has to do with the culture and the way people think. I started, when she became chief planner, she said, I started to peel away the biases. For example, a woman would get called out because her child was in daycare and sick and needed to go home, which meant the women had to go home. Instead of her manager saying, don't worry, the manager would apply pressure instead of giving her the space to be the mother. And so Jennifer Fix thought, well, this creates a kind of culture that says you can't be both a professional and a mother. That was problematic, obviously. Another reason that was frequently given is that, they're missing role models, and it's a self-perpetuating issue. One woman said, you can't be what you can't see, so there's a need for more mentorship and just having more women in those roles. And the last question I asked them was, what is the most important advice you would give to bring gender balance to life? And one of the things I heard time and time again is, this issue of unconscious bias. We have to take the blinders off and be aware that we have unconscious bias, which will allow us to broaden the narrow view of what a leader looks like and acts like. And here are a couple of quotes. So this comes from a partner from my firm. Our leadership team doesn't look like our studio, our communities, our country. Just a few years ago, it looked like a partnership of the 60s. We can't afford as a country, as a society, or as a company to let 50% of our really bright people not see themselves in the leadership. Now it's time to have some serious conversations about perceptions. It's about taking off the blinders and recognizing that perhaps you have your own inherent biases that you don't even recognize are there. To examine your own prejudices is an act of a will. Fortunately, now people are running gender bias workshops, and they can come into organizations and help us all understand how we have biases inherent in the way we see people and the way we think about the world. Another theme that emerged was this idea of creating equitable opportunities. So the idea is that the playing field is not equal, so you have to create different types of opportunities for different people. And here are a couple of quotes. So this one comes from a woman who was an architect who works in the Vancouver studio, an Indigenous woman. They need to actively recruit senior female staff. They need to promote staff. They need to grow the women into leadership positions. They need to recruit. They need to promote. They need to grow. Ensure they're given equal opportunities. Support them through flexible work environments. Recognize their achievements. The other thing is to ensure that women are paid equally. That's an action that they can easily do as an organization. If I was paid better, I could hire someone to do my housework, and then I could lean in. We all heard about the Lean In manifesto, of course. And then it's important to note, too, that, and I mentioned this earlier about intersectionality, that women, Caucasian women currently earn about 76% of what their male counterparts earn. Women of color earn 70%. So there's an added layer of discrimination and prejudice for women of color that need to be considered in this conversation about equitable opportunities. Something we heard over and over is don't make career and family a mutually exclusive choice. Don't make them two separate paths that need to be followed, A or B. And so here's one quote from a planning director on the prairies. Maybe different people want to work differently, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the model was conceived when there was one type of worker, but maybe the model needs to change with work shift, family shift, evening shift. There's a bit of space to navigate here. That shouldn't be punishable. The way we work needs to be adapted to all the different kinds of workers. And finally, and this is one of my favorites, is to just call it out. When we see discrimination happening in the workplace, call it out. And there's a great quote from James Baldwin. He's an African-American civil rights leader from several decades ago in the U.S. And he says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so Jeniffer Fix said, one thing she did when she started was she called out the inequity. She saw that, I'll just read you the quote here first. She says, when I started as chief planner, 8 out of 9 of my directors below her were men. She was the first female chief planner. And by the time she left, it was balanced, 50-50. And she also noticed that all the men in managerial positions were directors, and then women were below this level. So she called it out and she said, why do you have 5 managerial men below you? Why are all the women beneath them doing all the work? So just calling it out, calling it for what it is. And then the last thing I want to talk to you about today is you talked about what cities can be like for women, how cities look when they're by women, and now cities with women. And this conversation is really around intersectionality and recognizing that within this group that we call women, it's incredibly diverse, and there's a tremendous amount of wisdom within communities that need to be gleaned throughout the city design process. And so participatory design, so bottom-up design, where we're co-creating design solutions with community, with diverse women, is so essential. And one example where I can offer where this has been incredibly valuable is I worked on a neighborhood plan in a prairie community several years ago, and it was a neighborhood that had a lot of gang activity, a lot of violence, a lot of drug abuse, a lot of sex work happening on the streets. And a lot of the people who came out so for the neighborhood plan update, a lot of the people who came out to the planning process meetings were residents who were concerned about these issues and wanted to increase safety and say goodbye to street sex work and drugs and so forth. Fortunately, around the table we had a woman, and this photo is not from that. This is a different project. But we had a woman who was a former sex worker who was now in charge of this organization called SWAP, Sex Workers Advocacy Project. And so she was able to bring that perspective, that way of knowing the city to the table. And she told us that one of the design strategies to increase safety was putting lighting everywhere. In all the alleys and all the nooks and crannies, there'd be no space for Johns to pull over and have park with a woman safely. There'd be an incentive for them to leave the neighborhood. And she said, absolutely, I empathize with the need to have safer, safety prioritized in this community. However, a lot of these sex workers, if they are marginalized from this neighborhood, if they're not able to work in this neighborhood, they're going to be pushed out to industrial areas of the city, areas where there are greater issues of safety, and there'll be likely going to be greater incidents of violence against them. So is there a way for us in this neighborhood to think about safety, some of these issues that the other residents have brought forward, while also ensuring the safety of sex workers? And that was a real eye-opening experience for us, because of course, yes, we're women. Some of the women were designers, but we didn't have those experiences. We didn't have those ways of knowing around the city. So having that participatory design, that co-creative design process with diverse voices of women and others is so key in the city building process. So I'll leave it there. This is my email. This is my Twitter if you want to reach out to me in any way. But I know we have a little bit of time, so I was hoping that we could explore a couple of questions together. But before we do that, are there any questions you have for me, or comments or reflections on anything I talked about today?
So we have Naji over there. Yeah, it would be better if you approach so she can feel.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask you about the hula back that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate about it, more about how they locate in terms of the women's harassments and everything?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I'm not an expert in it, but my understanding is that it started in New York City, and I don't know, for a while they were circulating that video. I think it was very popular on social media a few years ago, where they followed a woman walking through the streets of New York City, and she had a kind of a camera hidden on her somewhere, and it showed how many catcalls and comments she got from men around what she was wearing, how she was behaving, and so that I think inspired the need to say, okay, well, what if we crowdsource collectively our experiences around this issue, and just share and get build knowledge around some of these issues. And it's been just incredibly popular. Women have been logging on and adding experiences on an interactive map, and it's now taken off in its cities across North America, including in Vancouver. Okay. And as I mentioned, the value isn't so much in terms of it's not like the police are watching the map and going to go investigate. It's more around creating solidarity in a sense of being part of a shared experience that has been, from what I've heard from the interview with the women in Vancouver, has been the most value. I don't know if that does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's actually answering my question. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah, we have another one.
Hello.
Hi there.
I recognize you. We were neighbors.
Oh yeah, that's right. Small world.
I have a question for you. With dialogue and maybe other previous jobs, are there any policies or practices in place to increase participatory design or co-creative design processes for your urban planning?
Yeah, it's a great question. So increasingly, municipalities I see are starting to adopt public engagement policies and frameworks to guide their participation, and they often use what is called an IAP2 framework, which is the International Association of Public Participation, and they have very clear guidelines around how to engage communities meaningfully, and lots of interesting techniques and tools to reach out to those hard-to-reach voices. So I'd say various municipalities employ them different dialogue in our planning group. It is so important to us to do meaningful engagement with diverse voices. So what we typically do is, often you see, someone will host an open house, a public open house. Come learn about this project and have your say. And those are important, but we understand that not everyone has the comfort literacy, the time, the ability to come out to those events. So we take our engagement out to the community. So we've gone to like child daycare centers, we've gone to health facilities on reserves, we go to strip malls, we go to libraries, we go to places where we know they're at-risk populations, and we bring the engagement out to them, and that greatly increases our ability to access those voices and ensure those voices are incorporated into the design process.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have another, yes, one more question coming.
Jennifer, I have a really quick question. I had written down a quote from you. We can't talk about gender without talking about orientation, and I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to that for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think and again, so I identify with a gender that was assigned to me at birth, and I am straight female. So my experiences are going to be different than a woman who doesn't identify with a gender that was assigned to her at birth, or perhaps is a different sexual orientation. And it's not an area of expertise that I have. However, I have seen some interesting mapping come out of different cities where, in the same way that there's the Hollaback example, where people who are queer are identifying places that are important to them and that have been important to them in terms of their own experience and why, and just building that understanding. I know also queer people are more likely to experience, in the same way that women are more likely to experience sexual assault and harassment in public grounds, so are queer people. But it's actually not an experience I personally have that I can speak to with any great deal of understanding. But I know it's an emerging field as well, understanding what does that experience look like. Do you have comments on that or reflections?
I am a queer person myself. I have experienced all kinds of harassment stemming from many different places, that being one of them. I don't know how much of that ties to being perceived as female in the public realm and how much of that ties to being myself. But I was just mostly curious with your statement. It sounded like maybe there's a belief or a teaching that's going around. I don't know if this is just a personal belief of your own, and that we can't talk about gender without talking about orientation, or if there's I'm really not sure what I'm asking, to tell you the truth, but I wrote this down, and it's just something that resonated with me, and I was just wanting to sort of pick your brains. But I think you've answered my question to the best of your ability.
Yeah, I guess just for me, the broader issue is this issue of intersectionality. And as a woman, I've experienced prejudice, and I have unique experiences and way of knowing the city because of my being a woman. But I also know that I carry a tremendous amount of privilege because of other reasons, and that it's so vital that women who have different experiences, whether it's in terms of able-bodiedness, income, class, ethnicity, country of origin, income, sexual orientation, that all of these makes a huge tapestry of experience that we need to be tapping into. I don't know what those are. I wish I had some more insight, and that's, I think, the next step of this conversation. But I think, yes, sexual orientation is absolutely one of them.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So, there's any other question or comment? Anything you want to add to the conversation? No. Okay. I was reading yesterday or the day before. I don't remember exactly. A tweet. It was obviously not directly related to this conversation, but it just came into my mind when I was hearing Leah. The last question. I don't know if there maybe are. Let me rephrase this. That can be drawn certain parallelisms between. Let me see if I can organize thought. So, gender assigned in birth can be seen as a bureaucratic process made by the government, thinking strictly on biology and maybe even looks. But gender is a more complex, sexual orientation is a more complex social identity that takes time to understand and takes time to develop. So the tweet that I was referring about, talk about, you remember this US senator that made a DNA test about having First Nation ancestry, and what they were talking is that you cannot define identity with biology. No, that's impossible. That's not correct to even try. So identity is social. It's something that develops and takes into consideration context and the culture and the people that surrounds you, obviously. Um, so I think, I don't know, I'm just reflecting while I'm speaking. I hope I'm not messing it around or maybe making it more complicated. So what I'm just basically, I guess, trying to do is that we should not mix biology with identity, or we should be trying to understand that uh, identity belongs to a social spectrum and is very complex, and we should not try to define it with a binary or even just in sections. No, I don't know. I don't know. I'm just throwing this out. I'm sorry if I.
No, Victor, I totally agree with you. And sometimes I feel conflicted when I talk about women in the city because I agree with you absolutely, and that's why I kind of started with that disclaimer at the outset that gender is not a binary; it's a spectrum, and sometimes when we talk about women as a group, we run the risk of further entrenching stereotypes and roles. So we have to be careful about that while recognizing that on average, people who identify as women still do experience the city differently. So we need to be aware of that, but at the same time, not making it so black and white in terms of a binary. And I agree that, using biology as the framing behind how we think about gender is not right. It's a social construct, ultimately. So I couldn't agree with you more, Victor. I think that's a really important point, an important context for the conversations you're having with around the women's way of knowing.
Yeah, so that's something that is striking me now, because when I was planning to this, making this course, I don't know, 6 months, 10 months ago, the old me wasn't aware of so many things that the today me is aware of, and that's the whole point, no? If you you move along in time and you grow old, maybe if it's just a few months older, and if you realize that the old you was a different person, I think that probably means that you are moving ahead. If you see behind, or you look to the past and you see yourself as the same, that means that you haven't really moved or you haven't really learned. And I guess that by saying this, what I mean is that we have to be aware that everyone is in constant learning and constant understanding. And so many things that we say and we identify as reality, again, is a limited bias. And the best thing that we can try to create or promote is the spaces to create this dialogue and safe spaces, which this class beautifully has been able to do. With our previous speaker, we have had some amazing experiences where the space was safe enough for each one of us to open and disclose things that were very personal, which is essential, I think. No, before your presentation, we were watching a movie which we haven't finished. It's just like the last 15 minutes that we have to see. I don't know if you know it. It's called 20th Century Women. It's quite recent.
Oh yes, yeah.
It's from 2016, so it's just two years old. So we were watching that, and it's really a beautiful movie so far. It's being impressive, incredible. And my comment when we stop it is that humans, we are so amazingly complex, and we have been in the last, I don't know, probably 2,000 years, maybe more, worked so hard to restrain that complexity and that diversity, and just keep everything and everybody in a bubble, which is very unhealthy. That's, I don't know, that's my kind of my quick take out of these conversations. Yes, we have. Yeah, sure, of course. One more question for you.
Great.
So I ask a lot of questions. Everyone makes fun of me all the time. But just to like have a takeaway. You know, we're going to be entering the workforce in about 2.5 years. You know, what can we do? I know, or sooner. You know, like internships. What can we do when we enter the workforce to encourage this kind of behavior and equality between genders?
That's a good question. I think everyone's path will be different in terms of their experience and the type of workplace they're in. But one of the takeaways for me that's been important, not just in my conversations with these women, but in my own practice, has been to constantly question and be aware of my own biases, because it's not that men are creating or reinforcing patriarchy. It's we collectively are doing that. So just constantly questioning my own biases, but then to call things out and to not be afraid to call something out for what it is, because you will encounter sexism in the workplace. You probably already have, in some shape or form, and just to be able to call it out for what it is, I think will start to change the culture and change what is acceptable. I think we're seeing it with the Me Too movement. It's really, really powerful. It's shifting things. And if we're able to have the courage to do that in our own professions, in our own workplace, I think it makes a big difference. So those would be 2 pieces of advice I might have to offer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there is no other comment or question, I guess this is it for today.
Okay.
Again, yeah, we thank you very, very much, and we will keep you updated. We will be in touch. So we will be listening to other speakers in the next 2.5 weeks, and then we will be working on there is a couple of methods that we are following. We're trying to crunch all these experiences and information into something. At least as an inspiration for designing a different world, a better world. So at the end of the semester, I'll be contacting you again. I hope I can. My wild dream is to broadcast the final presentation around December. So if you can join us, that would be great. So you know a little bit the outcomes. If not, anyway, I will be sharing it by email. So just that to keep you in touch. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, for hosting me. What a wonderful course that you've designed, and thank you for your work and advancing these conversations. And thanks to all of you for listening, for your great questions. And you're the designers of tomorrow, so I'm really excited to see sorts of solutions that you come up with, and some of the change making you'll be doing in your career. So thanks for having me. I should mention that today is my last day before heading on parental leave. So Victor, you might reaching me might be a little challenging in November. I'll have a newborn baby.
Oh wow!
but
Okay.
but wishing you all the best for the rest of the semester.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you anyway. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. So I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I'll
Take
hang
care.
up now. Okay. Bye bye.